Excellent. Looks like people are here.
Excellent. People are
And
here.
I will share my screen.
Welcome, everybody.
Right. Great. Okay. So it's recording?
Yep.
Yes?
Yeah, we're
Brilliant.
recording.
We're rolling. We'll make a start then. People should be able to just get in as we go now, hopefully. Right. So we are joined today by our very own Isabel, who manages our Careline team and has been with the business for over 25 years. I'm sure a few of you on this call will have met Isabel, either at an event or even potentially at your own yard with the Weybridge. Very, very experienced, knows everything there is to know about equine nutrition, so you are in safe hands. And we have very kindly also got Sarah from Redwings, who is the Equine Behavioural Manager. She's also been with Redwings for 25 years, so we have two very experienced presenters today. And she manages the Behaviour Centre at Redwings. So the way that today's session is going to work, we will start with Isabel talking through the feed and forage tips. Then Sarah will talk us through the enrichment piece, and then we will open up the floor for Q&A. I will be on hand to support with the chat throughout, so if you do have a question in the moment, just pop it in the chat. If I can't answer it and it's a specific question for Isabel or Sarah, we can pick it up at the end. But also at the end, you have the opportunity to come off mute if you want to actually speak and ask your question. And just a reminder, we do have our Careline service. So if anyone has a really specific question or you just would like a more thorough diet review, do contact us within working hours. Obviously we won't answer the phone tonight, but during the day, or drop us an email or head to our website and we will be more than happy to help. So over to you, Isabel.
Thank you, Bella. I'm sure you can see that chat message that you can deal with just popped up now. So welcome everybody to our webinar this evening. We're talking about stabling, box resting, the inevitable sometimes that we can't avoid. So when we first are thinking about this area, is it box rest or is it just no turnout? Whichever the situation, we need to be very vigilant of sudden changes, because if we go from a situation where our horses have been out 24/7, then during the summer, and we have a sudden change to that routine, whether that be from box rest or be from restricted turnout because of the weather, that will result in a sudden change in their diet, probably their forage, and of course their routine. And studies have shown that does increase the risk of colic and digestive disturbances. So we do need to monitor them really closely. We need to consider, if this happens, can we exercise them at all? So if it is because there's just no turnout, how can we exercise them so that we can increase the movement, keep the horses moving around? Is non-grass turnout possible? So if again it's because of the weather, is there a way of having them in a turnout pen, boxed, a loafing area as often they're now called, or even a larger barn? And then, is hand grazing possible? That we know with all horses there is a sort of an element of just settling them if they get out for 10 minutes of grass a day when they aren't able to be turned out and grazing. We see that in competition horses, and we see that on horses that are on box rest with no turnout. So is hand grazing at all possible? All of these things will help us adjust our horses adjust to this changing situation. Next slide, please, Bella. Apologies for this to work this evening. I am going to have to be sort of saying next slide, please, sounding a little bit like back to the COVID times when we were listening to Professor Whitty. But apologies for that. But we will probably get slicker as we get to it. I suppose the first and most important thing, and something that we never forget, but perhaps don't actually realise how important it is, and that's water. It's the most crucial yet often overlooked in terms of monitoring how much our horse drinks. We all know we need clean, fresh water in our horse's stable, but how much of us actually, when we tip the water bucket out the next day, or when they're in and refill it, how many of us actually really take a mental note of how much they've actually drunk on that day? Sudden changes, again, box rest, can drastically affect water intake. And a stabled horse on an all hay diet may drink to up to 40 litres of water per day. That's a lot of water, and one small bucket wouldn't be sufficient. Making sure that they have fresh, clean water will help prevent dehydration and, of course, impaction colics. So it is really important. Again, water intake is very variable, but the average is often said to be 25 litres a day. So ensuring that there is, as a bare minimum, for a horse at rest, that amount is really important. Remembering as well other things such as age, changes in weather, so horses with rugs on and it suddenly get warm, that may all increase their water intake. So making sure that they have more than they need is really, really important. See, she's got it. Thanks, Bella. And I've talked about monitoring water intake just a second ago. Again, not necessarily measuring it by the jug, but having a mental note of what's normal for your horse. Automatic drinkers, as much as they're brilliant in terms of efficiencies and helping you out on a yard, they do make it really difficult to track water consumption. And whenever I've been called into a professional yard where there's issues with horses, the first thing I do is get them to switch off an automatic drinker and put buckets in so we can really monitor what that horse is taking in. So using buckets in that situation is really important. Feeding, and of course, if you move to a new yard where there's an automatic drinker in place, don't assume your horse will suddenly know how to use it. Some horses are absolutely terrified of them to begin with. So, you know, in some situations, you need to make sure there's a bucket. Interestingly, feeding a mash can support hydration and encourage drinking. That's a little bit perhaps opposite to what we might think. We might think feeding a mash that's got more water in it will lessen what they drink. But actually, again, research has shown, excuse me, that having feeding a mash can actually increase their water intake. So with horses that you aren't sure whether they are drinking enough, just simply adding a mash to their feed or adding a meal of a mash can actually really increase their drinking. And that can be important in older horses, younger horses, any of those that you are concerned that there might be an impact on their water intake. So that's water. But the next most important thing is forage, the backbone of the diet. And it's the foundation of every adult horse's diet, every horse over 4 to 6 months. It's essential for maintaining digestive health, to make sure that they are working effectively from the inside out. It fulfills their need to chew and supports stomach health, gastric health, and of course mental well-being. A horse is evolved to chew for 16, possibly 18 hours a day, and so it's really important we try and mimic that environment for them. It's also important to remember that forage provides a significant source of energy, calories, obviously, energy and calories being the same thing. So what we've got in this situation is we must not forget that forage isn't just there as a bulker. It's not just the celery in a horse's diet. It actually does provide a significant source of calories, and maybe all a horse needs to meet their calorie requirement. Nice little picture on the right hand side there that just shows you how much. So the mg, for those that don't know, stands for megajoules of digestible energy, and just shows you how much calories, energy, is provided by a 12 kilo average hay net of meadow hay compared to such a small amount of balancer. And we'll talk about balancers in a minute if you're not sure what they are. Thank you, Bella. So I suppose the next question is, how much hay or haylage should I feed? Well, ideally, it's as much as your horse or pony will eat, being mindful of excess waste, because we don't want to waste too much hay, but also excess weight. We don't want to feed them as much hay as they will eat and then put on too much weight. The minimum of 2% body weight per day is on a dry matter basis, so takes into account or doesn't take into account the water content of that forage, and is for maintenance. We can feed a lot more than that should we need to. Bella keeps losing the next slide. Thank you, Bella. So what is dry matter versus as fed? Well, I'm pretty sure we've got some lovely return listeners. I was going to say viewers and listeners to this webinar who have perhaps been on our Forage Fundamentals webinar that was a few weeks ago, have been on some of our other webinars where we've talked about good doers, and we've talked about dry matter versus as fed quite a lot. So this is probably just a reminder to you. But it is really important because it's something that's often overlooked when we are formulating our diets or when people are recommended amounts to us. We have to remember all forage contains some water, and that water doesn't count towards the horse's forage intake. So we need to feed as fed. That's the amount that you're going to weigh out. The dry matter is the amount you weigh out minus the water. So we always need to take into account, if, for example, if we're feeding haylage that might have a higher water content, feeding more than we would do hay, which has a lower water content. So you've got a little, again, nice little graphic, which gives you an example of how much water would be in hay, which we might perceive would have nothing. Next slide, please, Bella. So again, this just shows you the difference between hay and haylage. Hay and haylage, the dry matter versus the as fed. So what we've got here is if we have 10 kilos of hay, the actual in as fed, so that's how much you're going to weigh when you put in your hay net, the actual amount of hay, the dry matter, would be about 8.5 kilos. For haylage, the 10 kilos of haylage would be around 5 to 8 kilos, depending on the dry matter of the haylage. So when we are feeding haylage, it becomes even more important to make sure that we're feeding enough. So then we move on to talking about soaking hay to reduce sugar. And this is something those of us with good doers, and I have one at home, and I have to say soaking hay this last week has been interesting with the colder weather. It's really useful to reduce sugar and therefore potentially reduce the calories of the forage that we're feeding. The guidelines again can be confusing because there is a lot of misinformation out there. From the studies that we've done, we recommend that in cold weather, so like we have got at the moment, between 6 to 12 hours to achieve the best amount of sugar loss that you can, remembering it's really variable. And then in hot weather, so probably temperatures above 16 degrees, 1 to 3 hours. The reason there is the difference is because that water that we get off the hay, so the effluent water, it starts to ferment and becomes very unpalatable and potentially can have microbes in there that are not ideal, not preferable to the horse. So certainly in warmer weather, we wouldn't want to soak for more than 3 hours. Next slide, please, Bella. Oh, thank you. So then we talk about soaking hay to reduce dust, because it is no matter how good our management is with our horses at this time of year, they are exposed to dust. Even if we've got horses living out, their heads down eating a bit of hay, maybe coming into a field shelter, they are going to be exposed to dust. And we know that the horses' respiratory systems are delicate. And so the more we can do to help reduce that exposure to dust, the better it is for them. So if we are soaking hay to reduce dust, the guidelines are to soak for 20 to 30 minutes, making sure that the hay is fully submerged into the water, and then feed immediately after soaking. Obviously, you can allow it time to drain. The reason for that is because as soon as the hay starts to dry out, the microbes, those dust spores and the microbes within them become prevalent again. So what the soaking does is it allows the horse to ingest, to eat those spores rather than inhale them. And so that's why it's really important that it is still wet whilst we feed it. Thank you, Ella. Of course, going back to the dry matter and as fed a situation, the after soaking, we're going to have less hay in the net because we've added more water. So something, especially if we have horses on restricted rations, this is something we have to be aware of. If the horse is eating as much as it can eat and in excess of its 2%, or 1.8% if it's on restricted rations. If it's being fed in excess of that, that's not a problem because they will be getting enough. But the moment we start to restrict the hay, we should be considering, and soaking it, we should be considering the fact that we need to feed more hay. So if again we go to our 10-kilo hay nets, and remember that we said a 10-kilo hay net, actually they're going to be eating 8.5 kilos dry. As soon as we soak it, we are losing that 1.5 kilos. So as soon as we soak that 10 kilos of hay, we're getting 7 kilos. So we actually need to increase our hay amount by 20% to take that into account. So I jumped the gun with that, with explaining that. So these are your really practical take-home tips. Increase the amount of hay you soak by around 20%, particularly important if your horse has no turnout or is on restricted forage rations. Use fresh water for every soak. Bit of a bugbear of mine because my husband, due to personal circumstances, my husband's been doing my horses for the last 3 weeks. And unbeknown to me, until I went out, felt well enough to go out there yesterday, he said, "Do I need to change the water every day?" And I said, "Yes, you do. You better have been doing that." I don't know. He said he did, but I'm not sure. So it is important. Again, we've got that effluent water that actually shouldn't be going down the drain. We should be putting it into other sources, and using fresh water is really important to enhance palatability for the horse. Making sure the hay is fully submerged into the water. If only half that hay net or bale is in the water, then the rest will be having the soaking will have no impact on the rest. If, especially in the summer, if we can do it out of direct sunlight, that's important. And what we do need to consider with feeding any horses on a forage-based diet, without any other feed, is an appropriate balancer is important, but even more so when we're soaking hay, because that soaking is leaching out even more nutrients than when we started with dry hay. So an appropriate balancer becomes even more important in this situation. Now, straw is a slightly controversial subject, perhaps, but again, those of you that have been on our previous webinars and our Good Doer webinars will know that feeding straw is a really useful way of diluting the calories of our forage ration for good doers, those without dental issues. And it's a really great way of keeping that fibre going into them, but in a lower calorie form. The key watch outs is that it must be of good hygienic quality and introduced gradually so that the horse can adapt to it, as it should do any forage, but also from a chewing perspective, because it does require chewing in a slightly different way. And the thing with straw is it's often treated as the lesser sister to hay, for example. So farmers might not treat it with the same care and it might be left outside. So the hygienic quality is really important. But any type of straw is suitable. We often get asked on the care line, which straw should I use? And actually, it's about what has the most, what you can get with the most, the best hygienic quality. So oat, wheat or barley straw are all suitable. As a guide, we would say replace up to 50% of the hay ration with straw. So if you were starting to introduce it, obviously we're going to introduce and build up gradually. Start with 30% of your total forage ration as straw. If your horse still isn't losing weight or is gaining weight, before restricting your forage even further, because you might already be on minimum quantities, then try moving up to the 50% of the ration and see how the impact that might have for your horse. One thing I will mention, and it's not been on the slides, but this comes across with soaking and with straw. I often get feedback from customers where I suggest this management technique or source, and I get said, "Oh, they won't eat soaked hay or they won't eat straw," and very often it's because we suddenly change things, or we suddenly try and give them hay that's been soaked for 6 to 8 hours. Actually, if that's the case, one of the best things you can do is just slowly introduce different things. So, start by just spraying the hay so it's wet. Once they're eating that comfortably, build up to it soaking it for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. Eventually, you will find they will adapt to eating it. And the same with straw, making sure, put a small amount of straw in there. They'll leave it to begin with, but then eventually they will start to eat it. So those are all really useful, good management tips to adjusting your horse to any of those changes in forage. people are very worried about leaving their horses for long periods without forage, and that is really important because we know, as we said at the very beginning, horses have evolved to chew for 16, 18 hours a day, possibly longer in some cases. And so if they spend long periods without forage, it does increase their risk of boredom, stereotypical behaviours, potentially gastric ulcers. So for those on restricted rations, we need to consider multiple small servings. I know that that can be tricky. We all have to work to keep our horses, and so having going up there 3-4 times a day is not always possible or even practical, but finding different ways of doing it wherever possible to split those servings up into more than 2 is really useful. There are lots of different slow feeders, hay boxes out there now that you can buy, you can make yourself, lots of different suggestions. And they may, and it does seem quite individual. What works for one horse might not work for another. And you might have to be careful if your horse has got shoes on, or if your horse is, got neck problems or anything like that, or back problems. It might be something you have to have a discussion with your vet or your physio about, but they can all be really, really useful. And then multiple double layered small hold hay nets. So that's your haylage nets, not just 2 but 3 inside each other. We actually have done some research, and that showed that feeding 6 kilos of hay in 3 doubled layered small hold haylage nets, so those are your small hold haylage nets, 3 of them, could extend eating time by 2 hours per night compared to feeding the same amount of hay in a single net. Now that's significant if we can do that. And if we could then do that split that hay into 2 different, I mean, I know this means having 6 hay nets, but if we could split that into 2 different places within the stable, we're potentially allowing that horse to move around, not just stand in one place, and actually extending it even further. So there is lots that we can do to avoid these long periods without forage. Next slide, Bella, please. Thank you. So we've covered off how important forage is, and I think that's a given, and we've covered off how we can continue to feed forage even in cases where horses might be good doers, and how we can support them with that. But the next thing we do need to consider is the importance of a balanced diet, because it is essential for supporting their overall health, well-being and performance if they are being ridden. If they're on box rest through injury, feeding a balanced diet will help support recovery from illness or injury. And what a balancer does, for those of you that are unsure, is it provides essential vitamins, minerals and quality protein without high levels of calories, starch or sugar. If you remember back to one of those very early slides where we looked at the difference in calories, in energy between a hay net and a 500-gram serving of balancer, it's absolutely, the thing that's the balancer is not providing a significant level of calories to your horse's diet. That's coming from their forage supply. So it's really important not to cut out that balancer or half it because you think that that's contributing to weight gain, while still feeding in excess of their requirement of forage. Because when we cut back on that balancer or take it out, we're also cutting back on those really essential vitamins, minerals and quality protein. So as a guide, the feeding rate for most balancers, the only exception being Grow and Win, is 100 grams of balancer per 100 grams of body weight, 100 kilograms of body weight. So that's 500 grams for a horse, 15.2, 15.3 up to 16 hand horse, 250 grams for your 12 to 13 hand pony, who could be around 250 kilos. Next slide, please, Bella. If we need more calories, because that might be a case, we might have a competition horse or a poor doer in an older horse who is being restricted or in terms of their turnout, box rest, etc. Then ideally we need to choose fiber-based feeds which contain lower or restricted amounts of sugar and starch. We know that starch and sugar can in some cases contribute to the risks of behavior changes, so excitability and are considered heating. They also can contribute to risks of things like laminitis, tying up, etc. So if we can choose fiber-based feeds and avoid cereal-based feeds, which are the main source of starch, then we can help in some of those situations. If we choose highly digestible fiber, so some of those kind of ingredients are things like soya hulls, which are a high fiber source of calories. Sugar beet can be a good source of calories, and oil for poor doers. Then these are high energy calorie ingredients, but without the cereals, so reducing the starch again. If we are feeding a cereal based diet, and in some cases that is necessary, again, a racehorse or a high performing event horse or a horse that's working very hard but is a bit laid back, then if we are feeding the cereal based feeds on the days off, as a guide, we should reduce by half from the evening before to the evening after. And the reason behind that is, again, the risk of having these high starch feeds in their diet when they aren't working. If you, in particular clinical conditions such as tying up, possibly gastric ulcers, Cushing's, etc., it's always worth contacting our care line or any care line if you're using another product to speak to a nutrition advisor to discuss your individual case. Most people know about oil being a really good source of calories, but did you know that weight for weight, oil is around 2.5 times higher in calories compared to cereal grains, but of course is starch free. So it's a great way of getting calories into a horse's diet without the cereals. It's also, being so calorie dense, it means that we can feed more calories with less volume, which again is key when we've got horses that we are struggling to split the meals into multiple different servings. Next slide, please, Bella. So if we have an underweight horse on box rest, so those that are struggling to maintain their condition, they may need higher energy and higher protein diets to support their muscle tone. The last thing you want if you have a horse who's a performance horse that's suddenly gone into box rest is to lose all that muscle tone. But we still should look for those low starch feeds that are high in digestible fiber and oil, because that's a great way of supporting them when they're on restricted exercise. But it goes without saying, and I said on the last slide, do consult with a nutrition advisor for tailored advice on which conditioning diet may be suitable for your horse, because in some cases it's not unknown for me to recommend actually one of our racing feeds to a horse that's on box rest, if that specific racing feed is appropriate for that horse, because it would provide extra calories. So it's not a case of just choosing what it says on the bag. Sometimes we have to look outside the box, and that's why consulting somebody who understands the feeds, understands the nutrients in them, and can actually listen to you about your horse will really help you tailor the diet and the advice. Next slide, please, Bella. We talked about dust earlier, and how no matter how good our management and our hygiene around our horses, there are still respiratory health concerns or considerations to have in place, because stabling for long periods may challenge respiratory health. And you might have the best management you can possibly have for your horse, shavings beds, or such like, cobwebs all out, soaked hay or haylage. But if your next door neighbour is on straw and fed hay, those things will still have an impact on your horse. So if your horse is prone to respiratory issues, consider a respiratory supplement that's rich in antioxidants. So particularly we're looking at vitamin C, vitamin E, and selenium, because they support the lungs' defences. And we have research to support how this particular product that we have shown here on the right does do that. And it is the original, it's called Winergy Ventilate, for those of you that have not seen it. It is the original research proven respiratory supplement, and it works by actually increasing the levels of antioxidants within the lungs and the lung lining fluid, helping to support the lungs, the natural lung defenses. So it helping to prevent the inflammation that is what causes the mucus and the coughing. And of course, as I've said, consider soaking or steaming your hay, or feeding haylage if your horse is prone to respiratory issues. People often say to me, so should I soak or should I steam? And it does depend on the reason that you're doing it. So the key here, if you're steaming, is that a commercial steamer is the most superior option for improving hygienic quality. Using steamers that are homemade. We've all seen them, the paint strippers attached to a wheelie bin. They don't reach the temperatures that are necessary to help improve the hygienic quality, to remove the bacteria. So it is really important the commercial steamer that reaches the appropriate temperatures is used, and also one that actually can penetrate the whole bale or hay net, whichever you're using. Some of, again, these homemade steamers don't do that, and they can cause more problems than they help with. It is estimated, though, with a commercial steamer, we can remove 60 to 99% of that bacteria. It also does seem to improve palatability as well. So if you do have a horse that's struggling to eat up its forage, steaming can help with that. Sadly, steaming does have little effect on the sugar content. So if you are wanting to remove sugar for calorific reasons, then you do really need to continue soaking. As much as this practically is probably very difficult, you can soak then steam. That would be a real gold standard way of reducing calories, but then also improving hygienic quality. And as I said, steaming, can improve in palatability. So it is a consideration if you are trying to improve respiratory situations and conditions. Next slide, please, Bella. So in summary, and some best practices, fresh water. Monitor that intake of water. If you're not sure, put some lines on your bucket, use a certain bucket, do anything that really helps to make it easy for you to monitor your horse's water intake. Ideally, provide as much forage as your horse will eat and monitor their intake. One of the questions I hear a lot at this time of year is, my older horse is losing weight. And the first question I ask them is, well, do you know how much hay they're eating? And the answer that will come back to me is, well, I'm feeding ad lib. I'm feeding as much as they'll eat. And that's not the question I'm asking. I'm asking, how much are they eating? And so in this situation, if you have a horse that's losing weight and you feel you're feeding as much forage as they will eat, weigh your forage in and weigh how much you're taking out, because it will make a real difference if they aren't actually feeding enough. And even though this is my job and has been my job for 25 years, I got caught out in this situation a few years ago with an older horse who was out in a field, living out in a field with my younger horse, and I was putting a huge amount of hay out, over a bale a day, and they were on grass, and I couldn't understand why the older horse was losing weight in front of my eyes, and yet I could see him with his hay in the hay with the younger horse. They weren't fighting over it. The younger horse wasn't pushing it off. And it wasn't until I actually had to bring them in to be stabled because the weather turned so bad and I was giving him his hay, I realized actually he was eating hardly anything. And the younger horse was eating far more than I even imagined he could. And even though the older horse was quidding, the younger horse was eating the quidded bulls. So again, I didn't have sight of that. So again, even though I do this job, that was something that I missed quite easily. So yeah, making sure that you really have a good understanding of how much your horse is actually eating is important. Obviously monitor their weight and body condition score, using body condition scoring, using a weight tape. Those are all good methods to help you keep an eye on your horse. Balances are really important for those that are able to maintain their weight on forage alone, because they will help to provide those necessary vitamins, minerals, and quality protein. And choose fiber-based feeds containing low or restricted levels of starch and sugar if additional calories are needed. Remember that the main source of starch is coming from cereals and mixed type feeds. And of course, look out for signs of colic. They can, in some cases, be really subtle. For some horses, it might just be that they're not actually eating their feed and they come in looking a bit uncomfortable. For other horses, it could be full blown on the floor, rolling around. So know your horse and what's right for them. Thank you. I think that was my last slide, Bella.
I think it was. I keeps changing between letting me click and not click. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Isabel. Over to Sarah.
Hello, everyone, and thank you ever so much for inviting me this evening, Bella. It's a pleasure to be here. So this evening, I'm going to talk about stabling, and we're going to look at it from the horse's perspective. So if your horse could talk, how do you think he would review his stable? Do you think he'd give it a 5-star review? Now, as humans who love our animals, it's nice to think of them all cosy in their stables on a cold winter's night. But given the choice, would our horses choose that cosy, dry stable? So to answer this question, the best place to start is to look at how horses have evolved and what they actually need to feel secure and happy in their lives. Next slide, please.
Oh, God.
Okay, although horses have been domesticated for over thousands of years, they're still driven by their basic instincts and their need to display natural behaviours. Now, there are 3 things that are really important to our horses, and these are food, friends, and friendship. Sorry, I'll get there in a minute. Food, friendship, and freedom. Now, the easiest way to remember these is as the 3 Fs. Now, the 3 Fs are increasingly recognised as essential to providing good welfare, and they're now reflected in law. So let's take a look at these more closely and find out why they're so important to our horse. Next slide, please. Okay, in their natural environment, horses would spend well over 16 hours a day eating, which is a huge chunk of their daily time budget within a 24-hour period. Now, although we often think of horses as grazing animals, they also like to spend time foraging and browsing. It's much more about the quantity than the quality of the diet. And horses require a high fibre, low starch diet. Horses are designed to eat little and often, and they would generally keep their stomachs about 2/3 full. As a prey animal who may need to run very quickly at a moment's notice, having a full stomach is not a very good idea. But on the other hand, horses would never voluntarily starve themselves for more than 4 hours at a time. Now, living this natural lifestyle allows the horse seasonal weight fluctuations. So this will reflect on the availability of food available at different times of the year. And this aids at help keeping the horse at a healthy weight. Now, some of the impacts on the horse when he's able to live this natural lifestyle can be obesity, boredom, frustration, stereotypies, and gastric ulcers. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to friends. Horses are herd animals. They should never ever live on their own. Being part of a herd keeps you safe, and it's vital to survival. Horses are highly social beings, and they form long-term bonds and friendships with each other, and they can remember close companions from the past. Being able to see other horses is probably better than not being able to see any other horses, but what they really need is to be able to touch and interact with each other, and it's integral to a good quality of life. Isolation is increasingly linked to issues such as anxiety, withdrawal, problem behaviours, poor learning ability, risk of injury, and many more. Next slide, please. And lastly, looking at freedom. So freedom is very important to the horse as a prey animal with a very strong flight instinct. Horses are hardwired for fear and flight responses, and if they sense danger, they will run and ask questions later. Space is really important for freedom of movement and freedom of choice, and it enables horses to move from grazing areas to watering holes to sheltering areas at will. Movement is also important to aid digestion, and of course it promotes exercise. And this way of living supports health of joints, the respiratory system, circulation, thermoregulation, social functioning, and many more. So now we've had a look at what's really important to our horses and what they need in their lives. Let's have a look at what the impact of stabling can have on our horses. Next slide, please. So stabling was developed historically for the ease of human management. So for example, it helps to stop our fields from getting too poached during the winter months, and it keeps our horses clean. And sometimes it just makes us feel better to think of them being in a warm stable. Traditional stabling takes away almost all the control a horse has over what he does, leaving him little choice in his life. Choice is really important to all mammals, including us. And if we feel we have no control over what's happening in our lives, it can make us feel very stressed. Although there's a lot more awareness of appropriate housing for horses and taking their needs into account, change is very slow and it's very costly. And unfortunately, traditional horsekeeping practices are still ingrained in our thinking and hence in our facilities. Next slide, please. So let's have a look at what impact a basic stable may have on the horse and being able to meet his 3 F's in his life. So first of all, confinement. So obviously a stable restricts movement and it restricts a lack of choice in our horses' lives. Separation and isolation. So horses are often stabled alone. They may often be able to see other horses, but as we all understand, horses don't just want to be able to see other horses, they want to be able to touch and interact. And unfortunately also stables very often mean that the horse has quite a restricted diet. There's no availability for grazing, there's no browsing opportunities, and again, they may go very long periods of time without food. So you can see from this, we're building a picture that stabling horses can be a real challenge, and it can be a real challenge to meet those 3 needs that our horses really need. When we're unable to meet these needs for our horses, it can really cause them lots of stress and anxiety. So let's have a look at some of the signs of stress we may see in our stabled horses. So here we very clearly have a pony who's demonstrating that they're not very happy. This is a very common stress-related behaviour that we see in stabled horses. This is called box walking. Unfortunately, these kinds of behaviours are very often normalised, and we very often hear, oh, well, that's normal for that horse. That's what he always does. What we should never ever do is ignore this behaviour, because this is a really clear example that the horse is in a negative welfare state. And what we should be doing is thinking, you know, what can we do to help resolve this? Probably the first thing we want to question is, does the horse really need to be in the stable? The other things we could offer is, does the horse need friendship? Does he need some company? Is he missing a close companion? Or will food or enrichment help lower and reduce the signs of stress? Next slide, please. This is another common stress behaviour that we see in stabled horses. So this is a stereotypic behaviour. This is called weaving. And this is a coping mechanism being displayed by the horse to show that he's very stressed in his current situation. What tends to happen when we see horses displaying this behaviour is, rather than looking at the root cause of the behaviour, people just try and stop the weaving. So we see things like weaving grills and weaving bars being put up, but that's not actually addressing the underlying cause. So again, what we would do is we would need to really look at how we can, what we can change for our horse to try and lower his stress. And generally with box walking and weaving, quite interestingly, if you actually remove the horse from the stable, we very often can reduce and even completely stop those stereotypic behaviours. Next slide, please. So what we're actually saying really is that horses are better out than in. Wherever possible, more turnout is definitely going to be beneficial for your horse. It's definitely going to support better psychological and physical health, and it's definitely going to help reduce those stress-related behaviours. But what if we can't turn out? And I appreciate there are lots of situations in our horses' lives where they do have to spend periods of time in a stable. It may be for box stress, for veterinary reasons. It may be that we have restricted turnout over the winter months, and obviously many other reasons. And being stabled, you know, we can make it a better place for the horse, but we just have to really think hard about those 3 F's and think about how we can perhaps replicate them a bit for our horse while he's in the stable. Next slide, please. So we're going to have a look at some ideas and some things that we do at Redwings to help try and meet our horses' needs as much as possible when we have to have them in stables. So just to give you a little background about us, we have over 1,200 equines across our 10 UK sites. We're very lucky that 99% of our equines will live out all year round, and the vast majority of them live in established herds. We only bring our horses into boxes for box rest, so for veterinary health reasons, and we have various housing options of different sizes and different dimensions. But our facilities at Redwings are not perfect, not by any means. If we could knock them down and start again, that would be great, but obviously that's not an option. So we have had to sort of think outside the box a little bit and make quite a few adaptations to our stables to make them much more horse friendly. So in the pictures here, you can see in the top picture, we've had some special gates made for some of our stable doors for our smaller residents and some of our donkeys. Really simple idea so that we can, when we've got smaller horses in, we can just pop these small gates on so that they can see out, so they've got a nice visual view, because the actual stable doors are far too big for them and they can't actually see over the top. On the bottom left-hand corner, this little setup's actually quite nice. We have a yard where there's some stables around an enclosed area. So this gives the horses the opportunity for some choice. So they can have the option of going into the stable, or they can have the option of walking around the yard. And also they can interact with some of the other horses as well. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, a very simple adaptation we made there was we took some of the breeze blocks out of the stables and we fitted in the grills just so that the horses could see each other and also interact with each other over the top of the stables. Next slide. Thank you. So interacting with other horses, as we've already talked about, it's an intrinsic need for horses to be with other horses and touch other horses. So wherever possible, when you're stabling, it's really good for them to be able to have contact with other horses, particularly with their close friends. Next slide, please, Bella. Some other ways that you could allow horses to have company when stabling is actually to stable the horses together. Obviously, there are a lot of considerations that have to be made for this. We have to make sure that the stable is big enough for the horses. You have to make sure that the horses are close friends and closely bonded. And you also need to make sure that there's no resource guarding going on. So that situation would need to be monitored. But it is really nice if they can be stabled with their best friend. When we're in a situation where we're unable to comply with this and the horses do have to be on their own, what we have found is stable mirrors have been really, really helpful. We find that these work really well, and we've found it's reduced stress in quite a lot of our horses where they have had to be on their own for a period of time. The only time you have to be very, very careful about using stable mirrors is with stallions, because unfortunately the stallions just spend their whole time trying to fight with themselves in the mirror. Okay, moving on, please, Bella. Okay, so what can we do about feeding rations when we have a stabled horse? Now, Isabella's touched on quite a few of my points already this evening. What we want to try and do is reduce horses being left without forage for long periods of time, because remember, they're not designed to not be eating. And as I said earlier, they would never voluntarily starve themselves for more than 4 hours at a time. So it's really about being inventive and about thinking of ways of how can we make that hay ration last longer. We've already talked this evening about the small hold hay nets and about doubling or even tripling the hay nets to slow down the feeding, the use of hay balls and feed balls. But I think what's really important is whatever you decide to do, don't make it too difficult. Horses in their natural environment don't have to hunt for food. They don't have to work too hard to get food. And if you make it too difficult, it can, in some situations, get quite frustrating for the horse. And obviously that's then going to cause stress, which is obviously counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve. One of my favourite ways of feeding a hay ration to a horse in a stable is by having multiple feeding points in the stable. So what you would do is you would get your total hay ration and split it into 3. So you may put a third of it in a hay net. You may put another third in another area of the stable on the floor, and maybe the last third of it in a hay ball. Not only does that give your horse a bit more choice, so that he can actually choose where he wants to eat, it's going to promote a small amount of movement. The hay net is a good way of mimicking the sort of browsing feeding that your horse would do. The hay on the floor is obviously going to help mimic the grazing, so his head is going to be in a much more natural feeding position, which is going to encourage normal tooth wear. And then obviously having the hay in the hay ball is going to get the horse to think and use his brain a little bit. Okay, moving on, please. Okay, so something that we can do for our horses, which is really nice when they're in a stable and they have no browsing opportunities, is to go out foraging for them. We try and do this a fair bit at Redwings. So the picture on the left-hand side is after a big, when we had a big windstorm one evening, and the guys went out and collected up all the branches and trees that had fallen down. This is all ash on the back of our ATV, and the horses absolutely love eating the ash leaves. What's really important if you're going to go foraging for your horse is that first of all you educate yourself on what horses can and can't eat, and then it's really important that you actually can learn to identify what plants you are actually foraging for. Could we have the next slide, please, Bella? So some of the things that we use to give to our horses as far as forage, we use things like cow parsley, cleaver or sticky weed, hawthorn, hazel and ash, blackberries. It's amazing how many horses we see picking the blackberries out of the hedgerows in the autumn, rose hips and mint. And if you could just move on to the next slide, please. And the list is endless, really. If you do research, there's so many things that you know, we could give to our horses while they're stabled. And it's really quite a nice thing to do. You can go out foraging, you can find out what things your horses really enjoy to eat. Again, this is quite seasonal as well. You'll have various things that are going to be growing. Obviously, this time of year, unfortunately, isn't great for foraging, but it is a really good fun thing that you can do for your horse if he's in a stable. Next one. Other things we can do is give our horse novel enrichment. So here in the picture, we've got the hay ball, and then the other picture, the ball there that's hanging from the stable has been covered in molasses, and then it has some, I think it was rolled in some mix, and the horse had hours of fun playing with that. I think the novel enrichment, these kinds of things are very much what I would call sort of boredom busters. These aren't things that are going to last your horse, you know, for long periods of time, but what they are really good for is for if your horse has finished his forage ration, they just give the horse something to do just to break up that time that he's standing in the stable. Next slide, please. Other novel things that we do in the summer is we often give them frozen treats. So if you wouldn't mind clicking on the first video, please. So this is really simple. This was just apples and carrots and water frozen in a bucket. This is 3 of my ponies who were spending some time on a wood chip. And again, on the wood chip, there's no browsing or grazing opportunities there. They'd finished their forage ration. It was a really, really hot week this week. And so we made them some ice buckets, and they absolutely, as you can see, loved them. And then in the next video, we did a very similar thing for our donkeys. The donkeys had carrot ice lollies. And again, they, you know, just gave them something to do on a hot sunny day. Something a little bit similar to this, which we find the horses quite like as well, is to do some apple bobbing or vegetable bobbing with the horses. We'll very often put out some buckets with chopped up apples and carrots and any other thing they really like in it. And it's really nice to see them bopping in and out of the buckets, fishing out the vegetables and fruit. Next slide, please. And again, carrying on with the novelty theme, my team are really good at coming up with these great ideas about what they can do. One of the latest things they've been doing is using the stuffed welly. So they went round all the local charity shops and they bought every single pair of child's wellies that they could find. And as you can see in the pictures, they cut various holes in them, and then depending on the time of year will depend on what they stuff them with. Over the spring and summer, they tend to go foraging and stuff them with things that they find when they're out and about foraging. But at the moment, there's not much out there. So they've been using just forage, carrots, apples, mix, rose hips, those kinds of things have been going in them. And again, it's just a bit of a boredom breaker, but they do really enjoy throwing the wellies around to get the treats out from inside. The thing with novel enrichment is that it does need to be novel. So you can't really give them the same enrichment every single day. What you want to do is have quite a few of them so that you can rotate them really, so that then the horse doesn't get too used to them, and then they'll always be exciting for them to enjoy. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah, first video, thank you. So this is just a couple of horses in the sanctuary enjoying some enrichment. So Sourdough had some very radical surgery about a month ago, and unfortunately she's going to have to be in a stable for a minimum of 5 months. So that's a very, very long period of time for a horse to have to stay stabled. So the team are doing everything they can to try and make her life as positive as possible while she's in the stable. So a couple of times a day they go in and she has some enrichment. So this was one of the things that they thought up for her. So this was just 2 lead ropes twisted together, and she had some beetroot cob nuts poked through it and some vegetables and fruit put through, and again it was just something nice to break up her day. Something else that they're doing with her as well is she's a pony that's clicker trained, so as well as her enrichment, what they will do is they will pop into the stable 2 or 3 times a day and do some training with her, which is just another way of enriching her life. Because she can't really do very much because she's on box rest, they're just teaching her a few tricks while she's in there, but it's just something else they can do just to keep her occupied. And on the other video clip here, we have Scylla and Ruby. So this is just a simple hay block. These you can buy. There's so many enrichment sort of toys that you can buy out there now. And little Ruby was a 2-month-old orphan foal when she came into us. And Scylla, who was a resident with us already, she very kindly fostered Ruby for us. And so there they are, just having a little bit of enrichment there in their paddock. Next slide, please. One of the other things that you can do that doesn't include using food is just about spending time with your horse. Spending quality time with them is just a really nice way to enrich their lives. So just being in their company, really, when we're not actually asking anything of them, so we're not going in there with a head collar or a saddle, or, you know, we don't want anything from them. We just spending time. And as we know, touch is really important to horses. It's how they form bonds and friendships with each other. And remember, they do that through this allo grooming, this mutual grooming. And we can mimic that through scratching them ourselves. There's some really good research out there that shows that humans can actually lower a horse's heart rate through using with a scratch, which is really good to know. So yeah, just spending quality time with them in the stable is always nice. One of the things just to pay attention to, though, is obviously when the horse is confined in a stable, is just really read and pay attention to how he's feeling, because in a field, if he doesn't want to interact with you, he has that opportunity to leave. Obviously in a stable, he doesn't. So just make sure that he is actually enjoying that interaction with you. And so what next? Wherever possible, I'm always going to say turn your horse out, because it is, if I think your horse could choose, it's where he would rather be. But if we do have to stable our horses, take a step back, assess the 3 F's in your horse's life, you know, and think about how are you meeting them, and if you're not meeting them, you know, what small changes can you make to your management to make sure that that you do. Search the internet for enrichment ideas. There are so many good ideas out there now on the internet, and yeah, it's absolutely teeming full of them. So it's a really good time to look. Keep up to date with the latest research and evidence that's out there. There is a lot more equine research happening at the moment, particularly on making a good life for our horses. So it's well worth keeping up to date with what's being researched. Normalise enriching your horse's life. I think sometimes we think of adding enrichment into our horse's life as something, you know, a bit extra on top of what we've already got to do. But what we want to try and do is just make using enrichment just part of our daily routine. It's just something that we do. And finally, and most importantly, enjoy it. Enjoy making your horse's life richer, happier, and more fulfilling. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really enjoyed that. It was brilliant. Oh, there you go. There's your thank you for listening with some cute ponies. Right. For some just housekeeping, and then we'll get on to the questions. For those of you that are AMTRA members and wanting to get your 5 CPD points, please scan the QR code on the left. For those of you that were just for fun, like to take part in sort of a general horse owners quiz based on what we've learned today, scan the QR code on the right, and hopefully you will all receive an email with those links anyway into your inbox. And also, if you could spare literally 2 minutes to give your feedback on the webinar, this is the QR code for that one. But again, I will email you the link. And for those of you that made it here, it seems I did send the wrong link out. So well done for getting here. And yeah, time for questions. So I don't think there are any unanswered questions in the chat, because one person has asked about good brash, but I don't know what that is. So if there are any other questions for Isabel or Sarah, please do fire away now. I can unmute you if you want to speak as well. Can't scan the QR code. Which one is that, Sharon? The webinar feedback one? If not, don't worry, because I will email it to you. In fact, I think an email should have already arrived with you, because I did schedule it for 8:15. So fingers crossed it's already in your inbox. Oh, the feedback QR code. Beesh is cutting from trees. Oh, I've never heard of that.
I didn't know either, Bella, don't worry.
No, me neither.
There we go. I've put them back up. But anyway, I'll email. So, any questions? Done such a good job, both of you. No questions.
I suppose just to answer the brash one, then that's probably to Sarah in terms of good hedging. I mean, you did mention the different things in your presentation that they can use, but if this brash is sort of hedging cuttings from trees, is there any that perhaps we should avoid?
I'm very much more up on what we can eat rather than
do can then, you know.
Yeah, I mean, around us we have mainly hawthorn and field maple and things like that, which is what we tend to our horses are browsing on most of the time.
Mine love ash. Mine are eating the ash leaves.
I like ash.
And willow is another one they absolutely love.
Yeah.
Yeah. The unfortunately ash trees, there's getting few and far between now, because they're all getting ash dieback, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a question here which I guess is for Isabel, which is it a good idea to add chopped grass such as ready grass to the stable to help adjust with reduced time in the field over winter?
I think if your horses, there are chopped grass is a really great way again of giving them a different fiber source. There are things that you need to be careful of. Obviously, chopped grass is as risky as fresh grass if your horse is prone to laminitis or weight gain or at risk from Cushing's. So it's taking the individual into account. Sometimes the chopped grass can be a little bit unpalatable and can be quite stalky. So if you do have an older horse with poor teeth, that might not be an ideal choice. And so again, it can be useful depending on the individual circumstance.
Any other questions from anyone? We are a little bit over time, so
yeah.
Although I did well to make up because we started a bit late, so we did good.
Oh, there's lots of ash going on in this lady's household.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Okay then, well, I will stop sharing my screen. I know how to do that. Isabel, perhaps you could stop
recording.
Yes. And we'll say thank you very much to everyone that attended. Thank you, Melody. And yeah, we'd love to hear your feedback on the survey. And hopefully we'll see you again soon.